My name is Nora Callahan, and I was 31 years old on the best day of my life when the worst thing that had ever happened to me walked through the door of my own wedding reception wearing a blue wrap dress and a confused expression. I want to tell you exactly what I was doing when it happened because the detail matters, and because I have replayed it enough times that it is permanent now, fixed the way certain memories fix themselves when the thing they contain is large enough. I was standing at the sweetheart table with my husband James, who had just made me laugh so hard at something his best man said that I had to press my napkin to my face to avoid ruining my makeup. The room was warm and golden and full of the people we loved most. The band was playing something low and easy. The champagne was cold. My father, Robert Callahan, was 61 years old and handsome in his rented suit, and he had cried at the altar when I appeared at the top of the aisle, and I had seen him cry and felt, in that moment, the particular swelling love of a daughter who has always wanted her father's approval and believed, in that moment, she had it completely. Then the door opened, and a woman I had never seen walked in with two teenagers behind her, and my father turned and saw them, and his face went white. Not pale, white, the color of a man whose two worlds have just entered the same room for the first time. I watched his face do that, and I did not yet know what I was watching, but some part of me, the part that files things and labels them and keeps records, started paying attention. Before I tell you who that woman was, let me tell you about my father, because Robert Callahan is the kind of man who requires context to be fully understood, and context is what I spent 7 years assembling. He grew up in western Pennsylvania, the son of a steel worker and a homemaker, the second of 4 boys, raised in the particular culture of working-class Catholic masculinity that values silence over expression and obligation over explanation. He married my mother, Patricia, in 1987. She was 24 and he was 27, and they were, by all visible evidence, deeply in love in the uncomplicated way of two people who have not yet been tested by anything serious. I was born in 1991. My brother Daniel was born in 1993. We grew up in a 3-bedroom house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, with a yard that my father mowed every Saturday morning in the same sequence, front to back, right to left, as methodical in his lawn care as in everything else. He was not an expressive man. He did not say, "I love you," easily or often. He showed love through presence and provision, through the specific acts of a man who understood his role as defined by what he built and maintained rather than what he felt or said. He was at every school play. He was at every soccer game. He drove me to college and carried my boxes up 4 flights of stairs without complaint and shook my hand at the bottom of those stairs when it was time to leave, because hugging was not something he did without occasion. I loved him the way you love someone who has always been there without always being present, steady, reliable, impenetrable. I did not know yet that impenetrable was doing 2 kinds of work. My mother, Patricia, left my father when I was 23, not dramatically. There was no screaming, no throwing of things, no single moment of revelation that I witnessed. What there was, from my perspective, as a college senior living 4 hours away, was a phone call from my mother on a Sunday evening in which she said, "Your father and I have decided to separate," and a phone call from my father the following Tuesday in which he said, "Your mother and I have decided to separate," and the particular quality of both calls was the same: controlled, careful, the practiced delivery of 2 people who had agreed on the script before either of them picked up the phone. I came home that Christmas to 2 separate apartments. My mother's was warm and newly decorated with the specific energy of a woman who is beginning something. My father's was sparse and functional: a couch, a television, a kitchen table with 2 chairs. I asked him why. He said, "Sometimes things run their course." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means your mother and I are better apart." I said, "Did something happen?" He looked at me with the particular look he used when a conversation had reached the edge of what he was willing to share and said, "Some things are between your mother and me." I accepted that. I was 22 and finishing college, and the divorce felt like something that happened to my parents and not to me, and I did not yet understand that the things that happen to your parents are often happening to you, too, just in slow motion, just below the surface, just out of view. I asked my mother years later, after everything, what had actually ended the marriage. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I found out your father had been lying to me for a long time about money." I said, "What kind of lying?" She said, "Money that left our accounts every month that he said was business expenses." I said, "And was it?" She said, "Some of it, not all of it." I said, "What was the rest?" She looked at me with the expression of a woman who has decided how much of a story belongs to her and how much belongs to someone else, and said, "I think that is a conversation you should have with your father." She said it without cruelty. She said it the way she said everything after the divorce, with the particular composure of a woman who had done her grieving privately and arrived on the other side of it into a version of herself that did not require explanation or validation. I did not have the conversation with my father, not then, not for years. I stored my mother's words in the place where I stored things I was not yet ready to examine, and I went back to my life, which by then was building itself with the specific forward momentum of a person who has decided that the future is more interesting than the past. I was wrong about that. The past, as it turns out, does not care whether you are interested in it. It arrives when it is ready. Mine arrived at my wedding reception in a blue wrap dress with two teenagers who shared my last name. I met James O'Coffer in graduate school. He was getting his MBA. I was getting my master's in accounting. We met at a study group in October and were dating by December and engaged by the following November, because James is the kind of man who, when he knows something, acts on it without requiring additional evidence. He is Nigerian-American, raised in Maryland by two parents who are both physicians, and who greeted me at our first meeting with the particular warm formality of people who take the introduction of a partner seriously and want you to understand that. James is methodical and funny, and has the specific quality of attention that makes you feel, when he is looking at you, that you are the most interesting thing in the room. He is also 6 feet 2, which is relevant only because my father, upon meeting him, shook his hand and said, "You are taller than I expected," which was my father's version of approval, and James received it exactly as intended. My father liked James. This is important. He came to our apartment for dinner 3 times in the year we were engaged, and each time he was warmer than I had ever seen him with anyone I dated, engaged in conversation, asking questions about James's career plans and his family and things my father cared about. I thought this was growth. I thought my father, at 61, had arrived at a version of himself that could extend genuine welcome to someone outside his immediate experience. I was right that he liked James. I was wrong about what it meant. The wedding was in September. We had planned it for 14 months, which is the amount of time it takes to produce something that looks effortless and is not. The venue was a restored farmhouse 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia, 94 guests, a band James's cousin recommended, flowers I had spent 4 months selecting. My dress was ivory silk, simple, the kind of dress that photographs well because it has nothing to hide behind. My father paid for a portion of the wedding, his contribution framed as a gift rather than a negotiation, which I appreciated. He was present through the planning in the way he had always been present through everything, steady and available, and not particularly emotionally engaged, but reliably there. He gave the toast I expected him to give, measured, warm in his way, a story about teaching me to drive that the room laughed at, and that I laughed at too. He danced with me to the song we had chosen,
Van Morrison's Into the Mystic, because my mother had told me it was the song they played at their wedding, and I had thought when I chose it that it would mean something to him. He held me carefully during the dance, and at the end of it he said, "You did good, Nora." And I understood that to mean both the wedding and the marriage and the life, and I said, "Thanks, Dad," and meant all of those things back. 2 hours later, the door opened, and a woman in a blue wrap dress walked in with 2 teenagers, and my father went white.
I want to tell you what I did in the 45 seconds after I watched my father's face change. I did nothing visible. I did not stand up. I did not cross the room. I put my hand on James's arm, which he registered immediately because James pays attention, and I said quietly, "Do not look at the door right now, but there is something happening near the entrance, and I need a minute to understand what it is." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Stay here." I watched from the sweetheart table. The woman stood inside the door, scanning the room. She was in her mid-40s, dark hair, the specific expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they were not sure they had the right to arrive, and is waiting to see whether they will be allowed to stay. The teenagers behind her, a boy and a girl, were doing what teenagers do when they are in an adult situation they do not fully understand, looking at their phones, looking at the floor, occasionally at each other with the particular sibling shorthand of two people who have been brought somewhere by a parent and are waiting for the adult portion to be over. My father crossed the room, not quickly, deliberately, the way he crosses every room with the controlled economy of a man who does not want to be seen to be hurrying. He reached the woman. He said something low. She said something back. I could not hear the words, but I watched his hand go to her elbow, steering, and I watched him guide her and the teenagers toward a side hallway and through a door that led to the venue's garden. And then they were gone, and the room continued around me as if nothing had happened, because for everyone else in the room, nothing had. I finished my wedding. I want to be very clear about this, because it is the decision I am most asked about when I tell this story, and it is the decision I am most proud of. I finished my wedding. I danced with James. I danced with my brother Daniel. I cut the cake. I talked to my guests. I laughed at the right moments and thanked people for coming, and held James's hand during the final song and meant it every second of it. I did not go to the garden. I did not confront my father that night. I did not make the worst moment of my life into a scene at my own wedding. Some people hear this and think it sounds like denial or avoidance. It was neither. It was a decision made clearly and quickly in the 45 seconds after I watched my father's face go white, which was this: whatever is happening out there is going to require my full attention, and I cannot give it my full attention tonight. And tonight is James's wedding too, and James deserves the wedding we planned. I gave James the wedding we planned. My father returned to the reception 20 minutes after he had left. The woman and the teenagers did not return with him. He was quieter for the remainder of the evening, and twice I caught him looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between guilt and grief and the particular terror of a man who knows that a door has opened he cannot close. I looked back at him each time with the expression I had decided to wear for the rest of the night, which was my wedding face, warm and present and giving nothing away. I was my father's daughter in that one specific way. I knew how to be impenetrable when I needed to be. James and I talked about it in our hotel room that night, not the long version, the outline. I told him what I had seen: the woman, the teenagers, my father's face, the garden. James listened with the particular quality of attention he brings to things that are serious, and then he said, "What do you need from me right now?" I said, "I need to know you are not going to push me to deal with this tonight." He said, "I would never." I said, "I also need to know you are going to be here for the longer version of this, because I don't think tonight is the full story."
He said, "Nora, I married you 3 hours ago. There is no version of this I am not here for." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I don't know yet." I said, "I think I will be. I think what happened tonight is the beginning of something I'm going to have to understand slowly." He said, "Then we understand it slowly." We went to sleep. I did not sleep well. I lay in the dark and I thought about my mother's words, money that left our accounts that he said was business expenses, and I thought about the woman in the blue dress and the teenagers, and the particular color of my father's face, and I thought about the way he had steered her to the garden without hesitation, the practiced efficiency of a man who had been managing two things simultaneously for a long time, and become expert at keeping them from colliding. They had collided tonight, and Monday morning when I got home from our brief honeymoon weekend, I was going to start understanding exactly how long they had been running parallel, and who had been paying for the second track.
I opened a document on my laptop the Monday after my wedding. Not a binder yet, just a document, a blank page in a folder I labeled simply questions, because that is what I had, not answers, not evidence, questions. The first question was, who is the woman in the blue dress? The second was, who are the teenagers? The third was, how long has my father known them? The fourth was, does my mother know? The fifth was, does Daniel know? I had 12 questions by the end of that first session. I printed the list, put it in a manila folder, and placed the folder in the bottom of my desk drawer. Not because I was planning anything, because I am an accountant, and accountants do not throw away questions any more than they throw away receipts. They file them and return to them when they have the information needed to answer them. I called my father the following Wednesday. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been waiting for the call. I said, "Dad?" He said, "Nora." I said, "I need to understand what happened at my wedding." There was a silence. 4 seconds. Then he said, "Can we do this in person?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I will come to you this weekend." He said, "Okay." He said, "I am going to tell you everything." I noted the phrasing. Not, "I am going to explain." Not, "I am going to try to make you understand." Everything. Which implied there was a quantity of things that was complete and defined and had been waiting to be told. I added to my document. Item 1. Dad used the word everything unprompted. He already knows the full shape of what he is hiding. Saturday, 2 weeks after my wedding, I drove to Harrisburg. My father was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex near the river, the same apartment he had moved into after the divorce 9 years ago. It was tidier than I expected. A man who lives alone for 9 years either lets things go or develops systems, and my father had developed systems. Books aligned on the shelf, dishes stacked with the precision of someone who has nothing to organize except himself, a photograph of Daniel and me from a Christmas several years ago. Nothing of my mother. I sat on his couch and he sat in the chair across from me, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "The woman's name is Carol. The boy is Ryan. He is 16. The girl is Emma. She is 14. And he stopped and waited. I said, "And?" He said, "And they are mine." The word mine sat in the room between us. I let it sit. I did not fill the silence because the silence was his to fill. He said, "Carol and I have been together since 2005. I did the math immediately, the way I do everything, automatically before I have decided to do. 2005. I was 14. Daniel was 12. My parents were still married. He said, I met her through work. She lived in Pittsburgh. I said, "You were married." He said, "Yes." I said, "And you have 2 children with her?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Born when?" He said, "Ryan in 2007, Emma in 2009. I was 16 when Ryan was born. My parents were still married.
The divorce did not happen until I was 22, which meant my father had maintained a secret family for at least 7 years while living in the house I grew up in and attending every school play and every soccer game and mowing the lawn every Saturday morning from right to left, front to back. I did not cry in my father's apartment. I want to note this because it is the part of the story people find most difficult to believe, and I think it says something true about how certain kinds of shock work. The information was so large that it moved straight past the part of me that produces tears and into the part that produces questions. I said, "Does Mom know?" He said, "She found out in 2013, before the divorce." I said, "That is why she left?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And Daniel?" He said, "I asked Daniel not to." I said, "And at my wedding?" He said, "Carol came because she thought I had invited her." I said, "Had you?" He was quiet. He said, "I had mentioned the wedding." I said, "You mentioned your daughter's wedding to your secret partner, and she interpreted mention as invitation?" He said, "I handled it poorly." I looked at him, my father, 61 years old, in a tidy apartment with a photograph of his legitimate children on the mantel and 17 years of another life in another city. I said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need a complete answer." He said, "Okay." I said, "What does completely mean in terms of what Carol and Ryan and Emma know about me?" He said, "They know I have a daughter named Nora and a son named Daniel." I said, "Do they know we did not know about them?" He looked at the table. He said, "Carol knows." I said, "And the kids?" He said, "I don't think Ryan and Emma fully understand the situation." I said, "The situation meaning that they are the secret and we are the legitimate family?" He did not answer. I said, "I have to go." He said, "Nora?" I said, "I will call you when I'm ready to continue this conversation." I drove home, and I opened my document, and I started a new section. I bought a binder the following week, not because anything had changed in what I was doing, but because the document had grown to 4 pages, and 4 pages in a laptop folder felt insufficient for what I was building. A binder made it real, in the way that physical things are real, substantial, tangible, the kind of object you can hold in your hands and understand the weight of. I went to the office supply store, and I stood in the aisle for longer than necessary before I chose it. Navy blue, 3-ring, medium weight. I brought it home, and I transferred my document into it, printed, organized by date, the questions from the first week, the notes from my father's apartment, and a new section I called the timeline, which was my attempt to map what I now knew against what I had experienced. 2005. My father meets Carol in Pittsburgh. I'm 14. My parents appear happily married. 2007. Ryan is born. I'm 16. My father attends my school play that spring. He brings flowers. 2009. Emma is born. I'm 18 and leaving for college. My father carries my boxes up 4 flights of stairs. 2013, my mother finds out. I'm 22. The divorce is framed to me as things running their course. 2023, my wedding. I'm 31. Carol arrives because my father mentioned the wedding and she interpreted mention as invitation, and the 2 tracks that had been running parallel for 17 years arrived in the same room at the same time. I looked at that timeline for a long time, then I labeled a new tab. Tab 1, the years I did not know. Red pen, dated.
James was the person I processed with during those first weeks, not because he had answers, but because he understood how to be present while I assembled the questions. He would sit with me at the kitchen table in the evenings while I worked through the timeline, and he would say nothing or ask one question when one question was what I needed, and he understood the difference between the two without being told. He said once, "You are building something." I said, "I know." He said, "Do you know what it is for?" I said, "Not yet." I said, "I know what it is. It is a record." He said, "Of what?" I said, "Of the gap."
The gap between the family I thought I had and the family I actually had, between the father I thought I knew and the man who maintained a second household for 17 years in another city. He said, "Are you angry?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I am angry in the specific way you are angry when you understand that a story you have been telling yourself about your own life is not accurate, that the version you had was edited before it reached you, that the events you experienced were real, but the context for all of them was different than you were allowed to know." He said, "That is a particular kind of anger." I said, "It does not have a clean name." He said, "No." He said, "What are you going to do with it?" I said, "I'm going to understand the full shape of it first, and then I will know what to do." He nodded. He trusted me with my own process in the way that only people who genuinely know you can, without trying to manage or accelerate or redirect it. I was grateful for that every single day. I called my brother Daniel 3 weeks after my visit to my father's apartment. I had given myself that time deliberately because I needed to arrive at the conversation without the anger being the first thing I said. Daniel picked up on the first ring and said, "I know why you are calling." I said, "Good, that saves us some time." He said, "Nora, I am sorry." I said, "Tell me what you know and when you knew it." He told me. My father had sat Daniel down 14 months before my wedding and told him the version he apparently told everyone, which was that he had made a mistake years ago, that he had met someone, that there were children, that he had been managing it, that he had wanted to tell Daniel himself before anyone else did. Daniel had asked my father whether he was going to tell me. My father had said he was going to tell me before the wedding. He did not tell me before the wedding. He brought Carol to the city where my wedding was happening without telling me she existed, and she showed up at my reception and told me herself, not with words but with her presence, which turned out to be more effective than words. I said, "Daniel, why did you not tell me?" He said, "Dad asked me not to." I said, "And you listened?" He said, "I did not know what to do, Nora." I said, "You could have told me." He said, "I know." He said, "I am sorry." I said, "I believe that." I said, "I need some time." He said, "Okay." I said, "I am not closing this door, I am just not opening it all the way yet." He said, "I understand." I said, "I know you do." I hung up and I opened the binder and I added a new item, tab 2. Daniel knew for 14 months, did not tell me, conversation documented, red pen, dated. I drove to my mother's house on a Saturday in November, 6 weeks after the wedding. She lived in the same suburb of Harrisburg she had moved to after the divorce, a small colonial she had bought herself with the divorce settlement and maintained with the focused self-sufficiency of a woman who had decided she was going to be fine and had kept that decision. She opened the door and looked at me and said, "You know." I said, "I know." She said, "Come in." We sat at her kitchen table and she made tea and she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "How much did your father tell you?" I said, "The outline." She said, "Do you want to rest?" I said, "Yes." She told me the rest. She had found out in October of 2013, not through confession but through a bank statement she had pulled from the printer before my father got to it, a transfer to an account she did not recognize. She had traced it. She had found Carol's name. She had found the address in Pittsburgh. She had driven to Pittsburgh on one Tuesday while my father was at work. She had sat outside the house for 2 hours before she drove home. She had not confronted Carol. She had come home and sat in the kitchen and waited for my father. When he came home, she had put the bank statement on the table and said one sentence, "I know about Pittsburgh." He had not denied it. She said, "He looked relieved," which was the most devastating thing about it. She said, "I think he had wanted someone to know for a long time. Being found out was easier than confessing." I said, "Did he tell you how long?" She said, "Yes." She said, "It was 8 years by then." I said, 8 years while you were married?" She said, 8 years while we were married, and then he continued after we separated. I said, "He is still with her?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Do you know if he loves her?" She was quiet. She said, "I think he does." I said, "I'm sorry, Mom." She said, "I've had 9 years to make my peace with it." She said, "Have some tea."
The binder grew through the fall and into the winter. Not dramatically, not with additions every day, but consistently, the way a record grows when you are paying attention to something over time. I added my mother's account, summarized and dated. I added the conversation with Daniel. I added a section I called the financial questions, which was the section that eventually became the most significant one. My mother had mentioned transfers to an account she did not recognize. I asked her if she still had the divorce settlement documents. She did, in a label folder, because she was her mother's daughter in that one specific way. I looked at the settlement, and I thought, with the trained eye of a person who reviews financial documents professionally, about what 17 years of a parallel household costs. Rent or mortgage in Pittsburgh for 17 years, 2 children's expenses from birth to adulthood, school, healthcare, clothing, activities, food, my father's stated income over that period, documented in tax returns he had shared with my mother during the divorce proceedings because they were required. There was a gap, not a small one, a gap that represented, conservatively, several $100,000 over the period that could not be accounted for by his stated expenses and my mother's settlement. I was not yet sure what the gap meant, but I was an accountant, and gaps do not appear in financial records without cause, and the cause, when found, always tells you something true. I added a new tab, tab 3, Financial Analysis, Preliminary, red pen, dated. I want to tell you about something that happened in December, 3 months after the wedding, that changed the shape of what I was doing with the binder. James's parents came to visit for the holidays. His mother, Dr. Adeaze Okofor, is a cardiologist with a specific quality of stillness that comes from decades of telling people things they do not want to hear and learning to do it without flinching. She is warm and exacting, and she had liked me from our first meeting, with a particular directness of a woman who does not perform approval, but gives the real thing when she means it. On the second evening of their visit, after dinner, she and I were in the kitchen washing dishes, and she said, "James tells me you have been working through something difficult since the wedding." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you managing?" I said, "I am building something." She said, "What kind of something?" I said, "A record." She said, "What for?" I said, "I do not know the complete answer yet." I said, "I know that it matters that it exists." I said, "I know that whatever comes next will require me to have assembled the truth clearly before I act on it." She said, "That sounds right." She said, "In medicine we call it the differential. You document every symptom before you name the disease, because naming it early forecloses options you might need later." I said, "Yes." I said, "Exactly that." She said, "What is the disease in this case?" I said, 17 years of a lie that was also my childhood." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Some differentials take time." I said, "I know." She said, "You have time." That conversation went in the binder too, not as an item, as a note to myself on the inside cover. "You have time. Do it right." My father called me in January, 4 months after the wedding. He had called twice before, once in October and once in November, and both times I had let him go to voicemail and sent a text that said, "Not ready yet," and he had respected that, because my father, whatever else he was, understood the language of not yet. This time I answered. He said, "Nora." I said, "Dad." He said, "I want to see you." I said, "I know." I said, "I am not ready for that yet, but I want to ask you something over the phone." He said, "Okay." I said, "I want to understand the financial structure." He was quiet. I said, "I am an accountant. I cannot help looking at the numbers, and there are gaps I want to understand." He said, "What kind of gaps?" I said, "The kind that represent several $100,000 over 17 years that cannot be accounted for by your documented income and expenses during your marriage to my mother." He was very quiet now, the quality of quiet that has texture to it. Then he said, "How did you find that?"
I said, I looked at the documents available to me. I said, I have not taken any action on this information. I said, I want to understand it before I decide whether action is appropriate. He said, some of that money came from a business account. I said, what business account? He said, I had a side consulting arrangement. I kept separate. I said, separate from what your mother knew about. He said, yes. I said, is that account still active? He said, no. I said, when did you close it? He said, 2014, after the divorce. I said, okay. I said, I will call you when I am ready to meet. I hung up and I opened the binder, and I wrote, detailed, every word of that conversation from memory, and I added it to tab 3. The financial questions were getting answers, not all of them, but enough to see the shape.
Spring came, 6 months after the wedding. James and I had settled into the particular rhythm of first-year marriage, the negotiation of small habits, and the discovery of which ones matter and which ones do not, and the gradual understanding that the person you married is both exactly who you thought and entirely more complicated than you anticipated, which is not a problem, but a dimension. I loved him more in the spring than I had on our wedding day, which I had been told would happen and had not entirely believed until it did. The binder sat in my desk drawer, growing slowly. Tab 1, the years I did not know, 14 items. Tab 2, the conversations, 6 items. Tab 3, the financial questions, 9 items. Tab 4, which I had started in February, was something new. I called it the second family, not to be cruel, because precision matters, and what existed in Pittsburgh was a family, my father's second one, and it existed whether I named it that or not, and pretending otherwise would have made the record incomplete. I did not know Carol or Ryan or Emma directly. What I had was information my father had given me, supplemented by what I could observe. I had driven to Pittsburgh once in March, not to confront anyone, just to see. I had sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the address my mother had given me, and I had watched people come and go and tried to understand what it felt like to be adjacent to a life that had been running parallel to mine for as long as I could remember. I drove home and added it to the binder. Tab 4, Item 1. Visited Pittsburgh. Observed neighborhood. No contact. Red pen. Dated. I want to tell you about something my father sent me in May, 8 months after the wedding, because it was the item that changed the register of the binder from documentation to something closer to evidence. He sent a letter, not a text, not an email, a letter, handwritten, 4 pages, in the deliberate, careful script of a man who has sat with something for a long time and decided that the right form is the one that requires the most effort. He wrote about the beginning, how he had met Carol at a conference in 2005 and had told himself it was temporary and then discovered it was not. How he had stayed in his marriage because he believed, or told himself he believed, that the children, meaning Daniel and me, needed the stability of the family home. How he had funded Carol's household through the consulting arrangement and managed the gap in the accounts with a combination of overtime and a small inheritance from his own father that he had not disclosed to my mother. How he had understood when my mother found the bank statement that the version of himself he had constructed was no longer sustainable and had experienced, he wrote, between relief and terror when she put the statement on the table. He wrote he loved Carol. He wrote it plainly, without apology for the plain statement, which I respected. He wrote that he loved Daniel and me. He wrote that he did not know how to hold all of those things in the same sentence, and that for 17 years he had managed by keeping them in separate rooms, and that the rooms had collided at my wedding, and that he was sorry for the colliding, even if he could not be sorry for the rooms themselves. I read the letter 3 times. I put it in tab 5. I labeled the tab, his account, primary source, red pen, dated. It was the first thing he had given me that was entirely true. A year after the wedding, September, James and I went back to the farmhouse where we had been married, not for any formal occasion, just because we wanted to, because it was a beautiful place and we had not been back since, and because James said,
I think you need to see it when it is just a place and not the place where something happened to you. He was right. We had lunch on the terrace and walked through the grounds, and I stood in the doorway of the room where we had danced, and I looked at it, just a room, wood floors and high ceilings and afternoon light, and I thought about the year that had passed since I stood here in ivory silk. I had assembled 31 items in the binder. I had had 6 conversations with my father, 3 with my mother, 2 with Daniel, and 1 with Carol. I had reviewed the financial documentation thoroughly enough to understand that my father had not stolen from my mother in any legally actionable sense, but had concealed assets during a period when concealment was a breach of the trust of marriage, if not a crime. I had not consulted a lawyer. I had not threatened anyone. I had not made any decisions about what the binder was for. I was still, as Dr. O'Coffer had said, building the differential. I stood in the doorway of that room, and I thought, I know the full shape now. I know what happened, and when, and who knew, and who did not, and what it cost, in every currency, financial, and emotional, and relational. I know the full shape, and knowing the full shape means I can decide what to do with it. James came and stood beside me. He said, "Ready?" I said, "Almost." He said, "Take your time." I said, "I know." I said, "I think the time is almost done."
I called my father in October, 13 months after the wedding, and told him I was ready to meet. He said, "Where?" I said, "Somewhere neutral, not his apartment, not my house." He said, "There is a restaurant I go to near the river." I said, "Fine." We met on a Thursday evening. He was there when I arrived, which told me he had come early, which told me he was nervous, which was appropriate. I sat across from him, and I put the binder on the table between us. He looked at it. He said, "What is that?" I said, "It is something I have been keeping since the week after my wedding." I said, "It is a record." I said, "I want to tell you what is in it, and I need you to listen without interrupting until I tell you I am done." He said, "Okay." I opened to tab 1, and I began, not performing, not accusing, reading, the way I read financial reports to clients, factual, organized, item by item, the full account of what I had assembled over 13 months. Tab 1, the years I did not know, 14 items, the timeline of what was happening in Pittsburgh while I was living my childhood, believing the story I had been given. Tab 2, the conversations, 7 items, every significant exchange since the wedding, documented and dated. Tab 3, the financial questions, 9 items, the gap and its explanation. Tab 4, the second family, 6 items, what I knew about Carol and Ryan and Emma and how I had come to know it. Tab 5, his account, the letter, primary source, dated. He listened. He did not interrupt. I read for 45 minutes. When I finished, I closed the binder, and I set it on the table, and I said, "That is what I have been doing for the past 13 months." He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Why?" I said, "Because I needed to understand the complete picture before I decided what to do with it." He said, "And now?" I said, "And now I understand it." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to tell you what I need from you, not what I want, what I need." He said, "Okay." I said, "The first thing I need is for Ryan and Emma to know the truth of what happened, not my version, not Carol's version, not yours, the factual version, that they have a half-sister and a half-brother who existed all along and who did not know about them." He looked at the table. He said, "They are teenagers." I said, "Ryan is 16, Emma is 14. They are old enough to understand that reality is more complicated than the version they have been given." He said, "It will hurt them." I said, "Yes." I said, "You have been making decisions for 17 years based on who you did not want to hurt, and those decisions have hurt everyone." He was very still. I said, "The second thing I need is a direct conversation with Carol, in person, with you present, in which we establish what kind of relationship, if any, is possible between me and your children. I am not asking to be their sister right now. I am asking for the possibility of honesty between us."
He said, Carol will agree to that. I said, I know she will. I spoke to her in April. He looked up. He said, you called Carol. I said, she called me. He said, she did not tell me. I said, I asked her not to yet. He was quiet. He said, you have been managing this more carefully than I have. I said, yes, I have. The meeting with Carol happened in November, 14 months after the wedding. My father's apartment, which was the only neutral space that belonged to all of us in some sense. James offered to come, and I said no. This one I needed to do without the buffer. I arrived first. My father let me in. Carol arrived 12 minutes later in the same blue wrap dress, which I registered but did not comment on. She looked at me in the doorway and said, you look like him. I said, people say that. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, my father at the head, and Carol and I on either side. I had not brought the binder. This was not a documentation session. This was a conversation. I said, I want to ask you something I have been thinking about since April. She said, okay. I said, when you came to my wedding, before you understood that I did not know about you, what did you think it was going to be like? She looked at the table. She said, I thought it was going to be the beginning. I said, the beginning of what? She said, of you knowing, of everything being in the open. I thought your father had finally done what he said he was going to do, and that the wedding was his way of bringing everyone together. She said, I know how that sounds. I said, it sounds like a woman who had been waiting for 17 years for a door to open and saw what she thought was the door opening. She looked at me. She said, yes, exactly that. I said, he did not open the door, Carol. You walked through a wall. She said, I know. I said, I am not here to blame you for that. I am here to understand what we do now that the wall has been walked through. She said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to meet your children. I met Ryan and Emma in December, 15 months after the wedding. My father arranged it as a dinner, the five of us, at a restaurant in Pittsburgh that Carol had chosen because it was the twins' favorite, which told me she had thought carefully about making them comfortable. Ryan was 16 and tall, taller than my father, with my father's jaw and Carol's eyes, and the specific guardedness of a teenage boy who has been told he is going to meet someone important and is not sure how to perform the occasion. Emma was 14 and quiet in the way I recognized because it was the way I had been quiet at 14, observant, processing, taking the room's temperature before committing to a temperature of her own. She knew the basic facts. My father had told them 2 weeks before the dinner, as I had requested, that they had a half-sister named Nora and a half-brother named Daniel, who had not known about them until recently, and that this was something that needed to be addressed honestly. Ryan had apparently taken this news with the terse economy of a 16-year-old boy, said okay, and gone to his room. Emma had asked 3 specific questions. How old was Nora? Was she angry? And was she coming to dinner? She was told 31, processing it, and yes. At the dinner, Emma sat beside me and after 20 minutes of general conversation said quietly, "Are you actually angry?" I said, "I was." I said, "I am less angry than I was." She said, "At us or at him?" I said, "At the situation." I said, "You did not create the situation." She said, "I know." She said, "It is weird, right?" I said, "Yes." I said, "It is extremely weird." She almost smiled. That was the beginning of something. I was not sure what yet, but it was a beginning.
I want to tell you about what I did with the financial section of the binder, because it is the part of the story that people assume was about money, and it was not about money, and I want to be clear about that distinction. The financial documentation I assembled was not assembled because I intended to make a legal claim. I am an accountant. I understand what is actionable and what is not. What my father had done with the consulting account was ethically a serious breach of his marriage and legally a question that my mother's divorce attorney had presumably already evaluated since she had the bank statement and the knowledge of Pittsburgh. The financial records I assembled were not for a lawsuit, they were for understanding.
Because money is the language my father spoke most fluently, the way he showed love was through provision, and the way he structured his life was through financial architecture, and understanding the financial architecture was the way to understand what he had actually prioritized across 17 years when the priorities were invisible to me. And what the financial record showed when I mapped them carefully against the timeline was that my father had been a consistent and reliable provider to Carol and her children across the entire period. He had not shortchanged them. He had structured his resources to support 2 households, which meant he had made a choice, clearly and repeatedly, to sustain both. And the choice required sacrifice, and the sacrifice had come not primarily from his own comfort, but from the concealment, from the cost of managing 2 lives that could not know about each other, which was a different kind of poverty than financial. I closed tab 3 and labeled it complete. Red pen, dated. My brother Daniel came back into full relationship with me in the spring, 18 months after the wedding, not through a dramatic conversation, but through the gradual resumption of the normal cadence of a sibling relationship that had been disrupted but not destroyed. He called more often. He visited once in February. He brought his girlfriend, who was warm and observant, and clearly knew the full story, and handled it with the grace of someone who has decided to be whatever the situation requires, rather than what is comfortable. Daniel and I talked about my father the way we talked about everything, directly but without urgency, the way of 2 people who have known each other their whole lives and understand that directness does not require a deadline. He said once, "I should have told you." I said yes. He said, "I convinced myself it was not my place." I said it was absolutely your place. He said, "I know that now." I said, "I know you do." I said, "What made you not tell me?" He said, "I think I was afraid of what it would mean for the family if I was the one who broke it." I said, "What family, Daniel?" He said, "Exactly." He said, "Exactly that." I said, "The family was already broken by the time he told you. You choosing silence did not protect a family, it protected a secret." He was quiet. He said, "I am sorry, Nora." I said, "I know." I said, "I believe you." He said, "Are we okay?" I said, "We are getting there. We are getting there on foot because the shortcut was closed, but we are getting there." He laughed. It was the first time I had made him laugh since before the wedding, and it felt like something returning that I had not realized I missed. The binder reached 41 items by the end of year 2. I want to be honest about something I noticed around this time, which is that the act of keeping the binder had changed in quality without changing in practice. In the first year, it had been urgent, the frantic, careful assembly of someone who is trying to understand something large before it overwhelms her. In the second year, it had become something else, more deliberate, less driven by urgency, and more by the particular satisfaction of a record being complete. I am an accountant. I close books at the end of a fiscal year. I reconcile accounts. I produce reports that say definitively, here is what happened, and here is what it cost, and here is what we have at the end of it. The binder was my reconciliation of the past 2 years, and it was approaching the point at which it would be complete, which is to say the point at which I had assembled enough to say definitively, here is what happened, and here is what it cost, and here is what I have at the end of it. What I had at the end of it was not simple. I had a father I was still in relationship with, imperfectly, carefully, not the relationship I had before, because that relationship was built on an incomplete picture, and incomplete pictures are foundations, and foundations need to be solid. I had a half-brother and a half-sister who was 17 and 15 and who I had now met 4 times and were in the specific way of teenagers, cautious and occasionally funny and entirely more complicated than strangers and not yet family, but something between strangers and family that did not have a clean name. I had James, I had my mother, I had Daniel returning, and I had the binder, 41 items, 2 years, every returned assumption and reconstructed truth and difficult conversation, documented, dated, filed.
My father asked me in year 2 what I was going to do with the binder, not threateningly, genuinely. We were at the restaurant near the river again, which had become something close to our regular place, a monthly dinner that had started as a mechanism for difficult conversations and had slowly evolved into something that resembled a relationship. Not the relationship we had before, and not a better one exactly, but a more honest one, which I had come to believe was more valuable than the version built on what I did not know. I told him the truth. I said, "I am going to keep it until I decide it is complete." He said, "And then?" I said, "And then it is a record of what happened and how I understood it and what I did with that understanding." He said, "For whom?" I said, "For me." He said, "Not as evidence?" I said, "Not against you, if that is what you're asking." He said, "I was asking." I said, "I know." I said, "Dad, I am not building a case, I am building an account. The difference is that a case requires an adversary, and I have decided you are not my adversary." He looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him before, something that was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who has been waiting to find out which version of a story he is the villain in, and has just learned it is a version where he is something more than that. He said, "I do not deserve that." I said, "Probably not." I said, "But I am not doing it for what you deserve. I am doing it for what I need. And what I need is not an adversary. What I need is the truth, which I now have, and a father, which I am still deciding whether I have." He said, "I would like to be one." I said, "I know." I said, "Keep showing up. We'll see." Emma called me for the first time on her own in January of year 3. Not her father's call, not a call arranged by Carol, her own call from her own phone on a Sunday afternoon when I was making soup. She said, "Is this a bad time?" I said, "No." She said, "I wanted to ask you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "Did you always know you wanted to be an accountant?" I said, "Yes, basically." She said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because I liked making things add up. I liked it when the numbers told me the truth." She said, "I think I want to study something with numbers, but I do not know what." I said, "What kind of numbers interest you?" She said, "Like data, like understanding what data means about people." I said, "That is data analytics. That is a real field." She said, "I know. I've been looking it up." She said, "I just wanted to ask someone who does numbers for work what it actually feels like." I said, "It feels like having a language that doesn't lie. If the data is correct and you understand it, it tells you something true." She said, "That is what I thought." She said, "Thanks." I said, "Call me anytime." She said, "Okay." She said, "This is not weird for you?" I said, "It is a little weird." She said, "Yeah, me too." She said, "But maybe the good kind." I said, "Maybe." I hung up and I did not open the binder. I did not need to. Document this. Some things you keep differently, not in a binder, not on paper, but in the specific place where things that are becoming real get stored before they have a name. Year 3. James and I found out we were pregnant in March. I sat at the kitchen table with the test in my hand, and James sat across from me, and we looked at each other for a long moment, and then he said, "Well." I said, "Well." He said, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am more than okay." I said, "I am terrified and more than okay." He said, "That sounds right." We told his parents first, which felt correct given how present they had been. Dr. Okafor cried, which she would later deny. James's father said, "Now you will understand everything," which was the most precise thing anyone said. I told my mother second. She cried immediately and without apology. I told Daniel third. He said, "I'm going to be an uncle." He sounded genuinely happy, the uncomplicated happiness of someone who has been let back in and is grateful for the space. I told my father fourth.
He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm going to be a grandfather." I said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to be a good one." I said, "I know." I said, "You have time to figure out what that looks like." He said, "Will you let me try?" I said, "Yes." I said, "Showing up is the whole job." He said, "I can show up." I believed him, not because he had always been reliable, but because in the 2 years since the wedding he had been more consistently present than he had been in the decade before it, which I had come to understand was the particular consequence of someone being seen clearly for the first time. When you are seen clearly, you can no longer manage by impression. You can only show up as you actually are and be evaluated by what you actually do. My father was doing that, imperfectly, but doing it. I told Carol about the pregnancy in April. She had sent me a text in February, a brief one, checking in, which had become something she did every few weeks, in the careful, understated way of a woman who is not sure how much space she's allowed to take and is trying not to take more than she has been given. I called her back and told her. She said, "Congratulations, Nora." She said it simply, without performance, the way you say something when you mean it and do not need to add anything more to make it mean more. I said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Okay." I said, "What do Ryan and Emma call my father?" She said, "They call him Robert." She said, "They've always called him Robert." I said, "Not Dad." She said, "No." She said, "I think they always understood there was something complicated about the arrangement, even before they understood the details. Children understand more than they are told." I said, "Yes." I said, "My daughter or son is going to have complicated grandparents." She said, "Yes." I said, "I would like them to know all of it, not the complicated version, the true version, which is that families look different ways, and some of those ways are the result of choices people made, and some of those choices were wrong, and some of them produced people who are worth knowing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think that's the right way to do it." I said, "I think so too." I said, "Carol, I am not sure what we are to each other." She said, "Neither am I." I said, "But I think we are something." She said, "Yes." She said, "I think we are definitely something."
My daughter was born in October of year 3, exactly 2 years after the anniversary of my wedding. Her name is Margaret, after James's grandmother, and she arrived with the specific furious energy of a person who has been waiting to begin and is annoyed at how long it took. James held her first, and then handed her to me, and I held her and looked at her face and felt something I did not have a word for, and still do not. The particular, profound, ordinary weight of a new person in your hands, who is entirely themselves and entirely yours at the same time. Dr. Okafor was in the hospital. James's father paced the waiting room for 4 hours before the nurse took pity on him. My mother drove up from Harrisburg and arrived 20 minutes after Margaret was born, and held her and said, "Hello, my darling," in the quiet voice of a woman who has been waiting for this particular hello for a long time. My father arrived the next morning. He stood in the doorway of the hospital room in the specific hesitant way he had when he was unsure of his welcome, which I had come to understand was not shyness but respect, the posture of a man who has learned not to assume. I said, "Come in, Dad." He came in. He stood by the bed and looked at Margaret, and he did the thing I had not seen him do since he cried at the altar of my wedding. His face crumpled, just briefly, the specific, unguarded expression of a man who is feeling something too large for his usual containment. He said, "She is beautiful." I said, "Yes." He said, "Can I?" I said, "Yes." He held her. He held her very carefully, the way he had carried boxes up 4 flights of stairs, with the focused attention of someone who understands the weight and does not want to get it wrong. He said, "I am going to do better." I said, "I know, Dad." I said, "Start now."
The binder reached its final item in November, 3 years and 2 months after the wedding. I sat at my desk on a Tuesday evening after Margaret was asleep, and I opened it to the last tab and I added the final item. Tab 6, Item 3. Margaret born October 14th. Robert Callahan present at hospital. First time holding her. Appeared genuinely moved. No performance observed. This is the last item I intend to add. I set the pen down and I looked at the binder. 3 years of documentation, 47 items, every conversation and observation and financial note and printed screenshot and difficult truth assembled in the precise, careful way of a woman who needed to understand the complete picture before she decided what to do with it. I understood the complete picture. My father had lived a double life for 17 years. He had built a second family in another city while maintaining the first one, and had managed the concealment with the same methodical consistency he applied to everything else in his life. He had hurt my mother, deeply and permanently. He had denied my brother and me the truth about our family for the entirety of our childhoods and into our adult years. He had been a reliable provider to Carol and her children throughout the period, which was not a virtue exactly, but was a fact. He had, since the wedding, made consistent and genuine efforts to be present, to be honest, to show up in the ways I had asked him to show up. He was not the father I thought I had before the wedding. He was a more complicated person than that father. I had decided, slowly and deliberately, and not without cost, to remain in relationship with the more complicated person, because the more complicated person was the real one, and I preferred reality to the version that had been curated for my benefit. I want to tell you what happened with Ryan, because it is the part of the story that I did not expect and that moved me most. Ryan was 18 by the time we had our third meeting, just him and me, without our father or Carol present, at a coffee shop in Pittsburgh that he suggested. He had requested the meeting himself through Carol, which had required more initiative than I would have predicted from the guarded 16-year-old who had looked at his phone through most of our first dinner. He arrived on time, which told me something else. He ordered a black coffee, which told me something else. He sat down and said, "I wanted to ask you something without Dad in the room." I said, "Okay." He said, "Was it strange growing up with him?" I said, "That is a complicated question." He said, "I know." He said, "I mean, knowing what I know now, like, was the version you had of him different from the version I have?" I thought about this for a long time. I said, "Yes." I said, "The version I had was more contained, more managed." I said, "He did not let much through." He said, "Yeah." He said, "With us, he's more—" He searched for the word. I said, "More present?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I wondered if that was because of us or because of what happened." I said, "I think it's because of what happened." I said, "I think being seen clearly changes people." He said, "You mean getting caught?" I said, "I mean being required to be the same person in every room." He was quiet. He said, "That must have been hard for you to deal with." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm sorry." He said it the way a teenager says something real, quickly, without eye contact, and then immediately looked out the window as if checking the weather. I said, "Thank you, Ryan." He nodded. We drank our coffee. He was a good kid. He was my father's kid and also entirely himself, and I was glad I had met him. People ask me what the binder was for, not metaphorically, not as a question about my psychology, but practically. What did you do with it? And the honest answer is that I have not done anything with it in the conventional sense of using a document as leverage or evidence or ammunition. It sits in the bottom drawer of my desk in a filing cabinet, behind the tax documents and the insurance folders, exactly where I put it on the day I assembled the first item. I do not flip through it regularly. I do not use it to fuel anything. What I did with it was the act of keeping it, which is different from using it, and which was, I have come to understand, the entire point.
Keeping the binder was the act of insisting that what happened was real and was documented and was not going to be rewritten or minimized or edited into a more comfortable version of itself by anyone, including my father, including myself. It was the act of an accountant who understands that the books must balance, and that balancing them requires recording everything, not just the entries you prefer. The binder balanced the books of the past 3 years, and now that the books are balanced, I can close that fiscal year and open the next one, which is the one that contains Margaret and James and Ryan calling me occasionally about data analytics programs, and Emma texting me sometimes on Sunday afternoons, and my father showing up in the ways I asked him to show up, and my mother in her colonial with her garden, and Daniel and his girlfriend coming for holidays, and all of it. All of the complicated, true version of what my family actually is, which is not what I thought it was before the wedding, and is more real than that version ever could have been. If I were to tell someone who was in the early part of what I was in, someone who has just had a door opened at the worst possible moment and has seen something through it they can't unsee, I would tell them several things. I would tell them not to collapse in public if they can help it, not because the collapse is not deserved, but because the public moment is not the place for it, and you will need the energy later for the longer work. I would tell them to start a record immediately, before the emotions are fully processed, because documentation made in the early days is the most precise and the most useful, and waiting until you feel better to start it means waiting until the details have softened. I would tell them that understanding the full picture takes longer than the initial shock suggests, and that the full picture is not available in the first conversation, or the second, or even the fifth, and that patience with the process is not the same as acceptance of the situation. I would tell them that the people who hurt you are complicated, and that the complication does not excuse the hurt, but it does require you to hold more than one thing at a time, and holding more than one thing at a time is the work of maturity, and it is hard work, and it has no completion date. I would tell them that the record you keep is for you, not for a confrontation, not for a legal proceeding, not for a dramatic reveal at a restaurant. It is for the clarity of knowing that what happened, happened, and that you understood it completely, and that your understanding of it is your own, assembled by you, not curated by someone else for your consumption. And I would tell them that the family you build with intention, on the other side of everything, is not a consolation prize. It is what family was always supposed to be. My name is Nora Callahan, and I was 31 years old on the best day of my life when the worst thing that had ever happened to me walked through the door of my wedding reception in a blue wrap dress. I am 34 now, and I am sitting at my desk in the house I share with James and Margaret, who is asleep down the hall, with the specific, profound completeness of a 1-year-old who has exhausted every resource she has and required us to exhaust ours in the process. The binder is full, the books are balanced, the fiscal year is closed, and the new one, the one that started when Margaret arrived and my father laughed, and Ryan texted me occasionally, and the complicated true version of my family became the only version